headed to political oblivion.
Breaking news.
The reporter must be able to think clearly. This sucks.
Exactly.
My name is Spencer Snyder, and today on Breaking News, I want to talk about the Queen and just how much coverage was dedicated to her. And specifically, I want to contrast that with how little coverage, comparatively, the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi got. Because the actual gulf in sheer minutes is pretty staggering. But before I pull out the graph, the Queen. What do we know about the Queen? Longest reigning monarch. It was just her Platinum Jubilee. She was 96, and her son Charles is now the king. I didn't want or try to know any of these things, but the media gave me no choice. But in all of their coverage, I think there was quite a lot left on the table that would have made the massive over-coverage of the Queen a little more meaningful, like the history of British colonialism that the Queen largely symbolized. Because what actual point is there in even covering the Queen or any of the royals? To me, the point of news in general is to decode things, put them in context, alert and inform people of information that might matter to them in some way. And when networks run endless hours of redundant coverage, there should be something in it other than just remembrances and tributes. But there wasn't very much of that. There was some, here or there. It was in that classic media style where a problematic fact, the kind of fact that might make their wall-to-wall coverage of XYZ topic look a little silly, that kind of thing is just always mentioned in passing, but not really examined. But for the most part, if you were sitting on the couch looking to fill the silence of your living room with the white noise of cable news, you'd be getting this.
She actually really liked Michelle Obama and enjoyed that visit. You know, then there was the Trump years and the Trump visit, which was somewhat different. But she's had an amazing, amazing time as the rallier of this nation.
Christian, you had something that most people, of course, almost no one gets. You had time with her, actually in person. In 2007, you were awarded the Commander of the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II. This was at Buckingham Palace. I just wonder, as you reflect on this sort of remarkable life she has lived and continues to live, what we didn't see that you felt or saw.
Yeah, I was in her orbit a couple of times, once then and once when she had, of one of her jubilees, she had a series of cocktails, including one for the great unwashed masses of the press. And, you know, there was a big hall and it was just crowded, but the minute she entered that hall, it was as if, you know, you could hear a pin drop. Everybody suddenly got silent. And then she wended her way through us, through the crowd. And she is remarkable. I mean, she was literally the queen of small talk. She could say anything to anybody. And no matter how banal it might have sounded, you were nonetheless thrilled that the royal gaze had been, you know, turned towards you. And I felt the same way when I received the honor from her and was frankly tongue-tied.
Well, it's always nice to see a member of the press dazzled by fame and royalty and enjoying their proximity to it. But you know, when someone in power dies, the media sets aside politics and scrutiny and really their own brains to just show what is really in their hearts, which is great admiration for power and respect for status. Because if she's saying she's thrilled to be noticed by the Queen, doesn't that contradict the idea that mainstream outlets sell us, which is that journalists they employ are kind of truth tellers who are impervious to the charms of the powerful and willing to grill them if needed? Or like the CNN promos that show these intrepid on-the-ground reports from war zones? Obviously, none of that is really characteristic of cable news, but I don't think it's unfair to say that that is contained in their branding. And that would go for network news like David Moore also. But as for me, I think crying over the Queen's death and showing up in places to mourn her is fucking weird. And I think the media's compulsive hagiography of political figures implicitly trains people to respect power, and it doesn't help anyone understand the figures they're talking about or what those figures represented. It's just glorified TMZ. So one story that stuck with me this week has to do with Kenya. Now, Queen Elizabeth actually learned about her father's death and thus the fact that she was becoming queen while she was on a trip in Kenya. She became queen in 1952. Kenya was a British colony at the time. And there were, surprise, surprise, quite a few people there growing slightly dissatisfied with their service provider. And in response to colonial rule in Kenya, something called the Mau Mau movement begun. The movement mainly comprised Kikuyus, Kenya's largest native tribe, many of whom had been pushed off their fertile lands in central Kenya by the European settlers. Along with other tribes, the Kikuyus had been forced to live in ethnic reserves that were too small for them and required to possess a special permit to move around the country. Many ended up as cheap labor on white-owned farms in what had become known as the White Highlands. Many of their European masters were young, upper-class British officers who had resettled there after World War I. Others had arrived from South Africa and British-administered Rhodesia. Most enjoyed a life of luxury on their large, servant-staffed estates, but by 1948, growing unrest on the farms had alerted the colonial government to the existence of the so-called Mau Mau movement, which it subsequently banned in 1950. But just 2 years later, violence erupted as rebels began attacking farms and killing Africans they considered to be supporting the regime. By 1952, a war had begun. Almost anybody even slightly suspected of belonging to the Mau Mau was arrested and taken to a detention camp or prison. As the war dragged on, the administration started relocating a large part of the native population to what it dubbed protected villages. These were surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by soldiers, and resembled the detention camps in everything but name. In total, up to 1.5 million were forcibly kept either in the camps or the protected villages. My understanding is that that number is slightly contentious, but a lot of people. In 1956, the Mau Mau leader was killed. By 1960, the state of emergency was lifted, the war was over, and then in 1963, Kenya gained independence. But that whole story is the product of British colonialism, which the royal family obviously is a symbol of. Now, it's not totally clear exactly how much the Queen knew, or if she knew that her picture was displayed in all the camps as people were being tortured until they pledged loyalty to the crown. But the point I want to make is that if you're talking about the royals and their legacy and the Queen as a stateswoman, then she's either responsible or she isn't. And if she's to be taken seriously, then you have to talk about stuff that happened under her reign. And more than just some perfunctory mention about colonialism. Because again, there were mentions of colonialism, or that the idea of the royal family is kind of outdated, but that was a tiny, tiny fraction of the coverage. So either she's a stateswoman who knows what's going on, or she's a rich innocent who bears no responsibility, and she's just basically a figurehead who isn't much more than a way to draw tourists to gift shops around Buckingham Palace. And in that case, there's no reason to spend an entire week talking about her at the expense of everything else. Which brings us to everything else. In Jackson, Mississippi, there was just a water crisis that left every person in Jackson with only bottled water for weeks. Obviously, if you watch Status Coup, you know about this story. But if you're a cable news watcher, then you could have pretty easily missed reports like this.
Some of this weekend's high school football games in the Jackson, Mississippi area will not be played because of the area's ongoing water crisis. Schools have moved to online classes. Many businesses there are closed.
Now, according to the Mississippi Emergency Management Agency, MEMA, there are now going to be 7 mega distribution sites set up starting today, with 36 truckloads of water being brought in daily.
So there are 150,000 people who live in Jackson, and on August 29th, they all got their water shut off. This was because a huge flood overwhelmed their primary water treatment plant, but they actually had a boil water notice since July, because as it turns out, the water of Jackson has just kind of been fucked up forever. The city first began receiving warnings from the Environmental Protection Agency in the 1970s, saying that the system needed repairs and improvements to avoid health hazards. And apparently, boil water notices are just not a new thing for the people of Jackson. In 2010, they made a pretty serious attempt to try to solve the problem once and for all by hiring a company out of Germany called Siemens to come and install new automated water meters, a new billing system, and they would make repairs to the treatment plants and sewer lines and stuff. This was the big solution that would bring in more revenue and save money, and they would hopefully be able to afford to maintain the water infrastructure going forward. Jackson would have to pay Siemens $90 million, but Siemens promised the new system would generate $120 million in guaranteed savings in the first 15 years. So the new meters and billing system would be way more accurate, Fast forward to people complaining that they were getting inaccurate bills because a bunch of these new meters were installed wrong or it didn't work the way they were supposed to. The new meters didn't work with the new billing system. I think they were incompatible. In the end, Jackson was stuck with a $7 million annual bond payment, a $2 million monthly shortfall in water fees, and a system of water meters that was not working. Jackson filed a lawsuit against Siemens seeking $450 million in damages. The city claimed its actual damages exceeded $700 million, taking into account the Siemens project destroying the city's credit rating and ability to borrow necessary funds. But they only ended up getting $90 million, and a third of that went to lawyers anyway. So that was pretty recent. Now, going forward to the current crisis, the water was just restored. So Jackson has water pressure now. But the story isn't over. The governor wants to try again to privatize the water system, and the repairs that just brought the system back to functionality, they didn't fix decades of aging infrastructure. And clearly, you still have things like this.
This is a hole in the ground. I'll get some close-up shots for it, but like you can hear water running down there, number one, and there's layers and layers of cones shoved down underneath. Cars literally have to drive over this, and there's nothing supporting the road. And I was informed by an engineer earlier that because there's multiple sewer caps here, there's actually a water main running right under this. Really? And then we wonder why there's water problems. How long has this been like this?
It's been like this about 2 years.
2 years.
Yeah.
And has anyone said at any point, like, if they're going to come fix this at any point?
Nah, they do just like everybody else you see and just drive right around it and keep paying no mind.
Okay, you have two overlapping stories. The Queen of England died, and an ongoing water crisis in an American city. And look, no one is saying you shouldn't cover the death of someone like the Queen. And I think the thing that people are identifying when you hear people complain that something like Jackson just wasn't covered, it's the disparity in coverage. Because big cable news outlets, they were talking about Jackson in the beginning of September. The blue line is mentions of Jackson, and the red line is mentions of the Queen. Obviously, the Queen hadn't died yet. They're not mentioning her. They're covering Jackson. They're not doing panels every hour. They're not making the Republican governor a national aim, but they're airing segments. September 5th, the water is restored. And by the 8th, coverage basically stops. But here is the Queen. And we are represented with a very different mode of coverage. This is what coverage can be when the networks are sufficiently motivated. So to recap, you have people in the UK waiting in line for 14 hours to see the coffin of a woman they've never met. Very weird. And you had people in Mississippi waiting in line to get water. And if we had a functional mainstream press, the coverage on these two stories would have been flipped. But unfortunately, we do not. And I think that will do it for me. You can follow me on Twitter or at my own channel. Just type my name into YouTube. If you like this content, please support Status Coup's investigative and on-the-ground reporting for as low as $5 a month. StatusCoup.com/join. A small percentage of people subscribe, so if you are able to be one of those people, it would go a long way to keeping this whole thing going. And I will see you next week.
You're now headed to political oblivion.
Breaking news.
Reporter must be able to think clearly. This sucks.
Exactly.